So what we're going to do just to kick things off and kind of get us into the spirit of the session is to start off with a warm-up activity. So one thing that we want to do is throughout this writing gym to really help foster that sense of community and really to have a bit of fun with it is to put together a bit of a collaborative writing playlist. So what we want to do is really bring together a list of all of the different songs and music that we've chosen to support our writing. So to kickstart this today, the theme is songs to help start the day. So what we'd like you to do is take 3 minutes to think of 3 songs that fit this theme for you. So they could be songs you listen to kickstart your motivation when you first start writing. They could be songs that you put on with your first morning cup of coffee to ease you into the day. It could be absolutely anything, but this is going to form the start of what's going to be our playlist throughout the summer to help support us and encourage us in our writing. So what I'm going to ask you to do is spend a few minutes now to have a think about those songs, brainstorm them, and then when you're ready and happy to, if you want to share those in the chat, that's just our little start activity to get us warmed up and ready for the session. So the idea really with this playlist is we're going to set this up on the online discussion board and on the writing space, and really just kind of populate it week on week with different suggestions for our writing playlist. Some, for kind of staying focused, some some songs for getting motivated. It's something that I've sort of contributed to before in another writing retreat, and it worked really nicely sometimes, again, to help that sense of what are other people listening to. You're listening to the same playlist at that time to kind of crack on with work and get you in the mood to write. So if any more suggestions or any more ideas do come to you, feel free to pop those in the chat as we go through. Yeah, definitely use that chat space to share those ideas, and we'll start putting this playlist together after the session.
Yes.
So to get started, I think I'll just quickly run through some of the kind of main objectives for this session, really. We'll be thinking about 3 key parts of getting to know your research. So we'll first start off by spending a little bit of time reflecting on what makes our projects unique. This can be a useful motivator, but it can also be a really important thing to actually sit down and write about. It's something that you need to factor in to those introductions and literature reviews. What is it that makes our projects unique? And what are we contributing through creating those projects and writing up those final reports and dissertations? We'll then go on to write the Hollywood pitch for our research, and Matt's going to talk us through that in a little bit. And that's going to lead us to our final section of the session, which will be to develop the research daisy. Now, as I mentioned earlier, what we'll be doing is recording this session and sharing that with you, as well as any of the handouts and resources or websites that we point you to throughout this session. So of course, feel free to make notes, but this is going to be mostly kind of participating, taking parts in the activities, and we'll make sure we give you all the resources to develop these ideas further after the session. Okay.
Cool. Right, I'm going to hop in now and take over. So first thing I want to kind of talk to you about today is really to get you thinking about your research as a story, because every bit of research that is conducted, the projects that you're working on, they're going to tell a tale, and they are exciting and they are unique. Every project, each one that you're doing, it's unique, it's interesting. There are things about it that are exciting, and there are things about it that are going to be new, and you're going to make your own unique contribution to the academic sphere, whichever discipline you're kind of working within. But sometimes that can be hard to find, and it's a really important thing that you do find it, because kind of as Kirsty has already mentioned, when you're writing your introduction, it's really important to kind of draw your reader in and tell them why they should care about your project. It's about drawing their attention and saying, look at this thing, it's important because. It's about kind of hooking them in. And that's what I kind of want to talk to you about and get you thinking about this idea of your research as a story, because when you come to write research, you're going to absolutely find that you have heroes and you have villains. You're going to have those authors that absolutely agree with what you're saying, for example, and you think, yes, I completely agree with them. And you're going to find these authors that have come up with a counterpoint to what you're trying to suggest, and you're going to have to find a way to kind of knock them back and bat away their theory or show why you're not convinced by it. So telling your research story is about thinking about what your research is, if you were to summarize it a bit like the plot of a book or a movie or something like that. So you've got these kind of 4 main points. So there's the hook, which is the aim or research question. What is your research hoping to achieve, or what's the question it's going to answer? And that should be what you use to draw your readers in, draw the people. If you're talking to someone about it, explain to them why it's interesting. What will your research achieve? Then you have a setting, like in kind of any piece of literature, a movie, you've got a backdrop to it all. And in the case of your research, that's the wider context, because what you're doing will add to a larger body of literature. And often you have to find where your work is situated among that kind of wider body of literature. And that's something we'll start to look at as well when we come to the Research Daisy activity later. Main characters. Now, there's a couple of ways of thinking about main characters. Here, I've put the participants, so the people that take part in your experiment, the kind of the data that you collect from them, and role as a researcher. Especially if you're doing maybe a qualitative project that might include reflections, you've really got to think about your own positionality. Any researcher should always be aware of this, whether they're doing a really quantitatively focused project or a qualitatively kind of focused one. But thinking about your position as a researcher, your reflections, participants, why they're unique, why they're important, what that's adding to the academic discussion. But also your main characters might be theories. Especially if you were writing something like an extended literature review, it might be the key theories and the way that these theories interact, the debates that arise between them, and highlighting what's interesting, unique about those debates, what those debates tell us. And then you can think about your key plot points and the main parts of your project. You have the introduction, which brings your reader in, highlights why things are important, introduces the setting, the context for your research. You have methods. How are you actually going to go and collect your data? Why have you chosen that method? Results. What did you find? And then you've got the discussion, findings, whatever it's called in your discipline, where you interpret that, compare it against the wider literature, and you come out with conclusions. I often say to students that kind of the bit where you talk about potential future research is almost the post-credits scene. It's almost the plot hook for the sequel, because often, and I think this is one of the wonderful things about research, we answer one question and then we find out that we need to answer 3 more, and I think that's fantastic, and that's kind of the last part of your project. So I want us to think about this idea of telling your research story, because really distilling what the essence of your research is and thinking, well, what is my hook? Why is this interesting? Why should people care about that? Is a great way of getting that clear in your own mind, so then you can really communicate it effectively when you come to write your introduction. So one of the ways I think you can go about doing this is to have a go at essentially writing what I call the Hollywood pitch for your research. This is a bit like a non-academic abstract. So what I want you to do is have a go at writing between 200 to 300 words where you're thinking about the story of your research. And the real goal of this task is to imagine that you're trying to convince someone that they should care about your research. You're trying to really get them on board with it. I personally have had a lot of experience about this, because I remember I wrote my undergrad dissertation about a really, really boring, very niche topic that no one was kind of interested in whatsoever, about a very strange visual phobia called trypophobia. Google it. I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with it. But anyway, but I got very practiced at getting people bored, because on the face of it, it was very dry. So I kind of went through this process of thinking, how do you get people excited about something that's exciting to you? Hopefully you're all excited by the project you're doing, but how do you get other people on board? How do you convey your passion for the subject? So we're going to have a go at doing this. Have this short writing activity. We're not going to go into breakout rooms for this one. We're just going to be writing this kind of with our mics muted, kind of cameras off, but we'll be all writing together. As I say, 200 to 300 words that answer the following questions. Think about what the set of your research is. Who are the main characters? What are the important theories, ideas that you want to convey to someone? What's the problem, issue, or gap that your project is seeking to address? Really highlighting, why is your research happening? It's really important to remember research should be purposeful. If the research kind of issue that you're looking to address has already been answered, then you don't need to do the piece of research. So there is going to be something that you are seeking to address. And then thinking about, why does this need solving? So you could call this the so what question. You know, you pose a problem and you say this problem exists in the world, but then someone says to you, but does it actually need solving? And you also need to explain, well, yes, it does need solving because, and this is about thinking about implications, whether that's for our understanding of an idea, a construct, theory, professional practice. Again, that's going to be very specific to your different disciplines. And that's kind of that final point. What are these findings going to add to the academic conversation? What is going to be the contribution of your project? So hopefully that makes sense. I do want to stress this doesn't need to be really academic in tone. This can be quite informal in the way you write, because this is drawing out that essence of your research and really distilling what is interesting and exciting about it. So I'm going to say 10 minutes, so we'll do this until just after past. Kirsty and I will stay in the room. If you've got any questions, you can pop them in the chat. And then once we're finished with that, if anyone is feeling brave, they'll have the opportunity to share with the rest of the group their Hollywood pitch for their piece of research. Okay? Okay, everyone. So you can all just stop there. Don't worry if you haven't finished. I think I myself realized that maybe 300 words was quite ambitious in 10 minutes. I don't know if Kirsty, I don't know if you had a go at it while we were.
Yeah, I had a bit of a go. Yeah, I find writing in full sentences really hard. I've just got sort of like a loads of sort of ideas all over the page. I think the one that I found the hardest to answer was the third one. Why does this problem or issue need solving? Just because I hit that and my instinct was to write because it's interesting, or because it's a subject that I'm passionate about, and it was hard to try and think about, but what's the hook for someone? Why actually, if I needed to defend and convince someone that this project was worthwhile, what would I actually say to convince them? So that was interesting, and I think the way I was trying to think of it as well was, if I was trying to pitch this to someone, trying to aim that at almost a non-specialist audience. So if it was someone who didn't share my background or know a lot really about my own project, how could I put it into terms that could get that across to them? So I think that's what I was trying to think about. How do we sell it to almost like a layman, someone who doesn't have that specialist knowledge? How can I hook them and convince them that this is a project that will contribute something to, as you say, that academic conversation? So yeah, those are some of the things that I was thinking about as I was making notes and writing it.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I also really struggled with point 3, actually, and I think it is a really hard thing sometimes to address. Why does this need to happen? And I'm hoping the next couple of slides will start to get us thinking about that a little bit. But I do think it's probably the hardest one often to answer. Why are we actually doing this? Why does this need to happen? And I just personally found it quite difficult. I kept slipping back into more academic language.
Yeah.
And like you say, in terms of talking about technical language versus not, I kept slipping back in and thinking, but that wouldn't be a way to actually get someone on board with the project. If talking to a group of non-specialists, you've suddenly slipped into this very subject-specific language.
Yeah. I think as well, sort of, it's funny, isn't it? Because I think when you start to think about, why solve this problem? Why is it an issue? Sometimes you feel like you sort of self-censor. Because I was writing it, I thought, this isn't very cool, is it? To say that, because I was thinking about when I did my PhD and I was writing it for that and thinking, whether or not how we translate literature has changed. And then I found myself thinking, is that enough? Is that a bit of a weird thing to feel like that's the need? So I think actually it's this is a useful process to go through. These are useful questions to ask, because it kind of encourages you to bring out that personal interest and passion. Like, yeah, okay, someone else might not think it's cool, but for me, that's the thing that's kind of driving me forward. That's the thing that I want to achieve with it. Whether or not other people find that interesting or cool, then that's fine. But I don't know. I found myself caught up in that thinking there. Yeah.
Well, absolutely. I think it makes you interrogate your own thought processes around the piece of research as well. It makes you defend your position, and I think, like you say, it naturally brings out your own passion and excitement for the topic, which then I think transfers into a better quality of writing, especially in drawing your readers in, especially in the introduction, where you really hook them and grab their attention. I don't know if anyone just wanted to share any thoughts that they had about the task in the chat function, or if anyone felt particularly brave, they'd be welcome to share those, although absolutely no pressure to, because you know, I don't have anything completely to share either. But any thoughts that you have about the task, please do pop them in the chat. So I'll give us a couple of minutes to do that before we move on to the next few slides.
Yeah, particularly if anyone found one of those questions a bit harder than the others, it'd be interesting to know where else other people kind of found it hard to make progress or to answer that prompt question.
Absolutely. Because I think in many ways these 4 questions are a very, very basic skeleton almost for what a research project ends up being, although obviously there's a lack of any reference to methodology here, but kind of for them, this is what you end up doing. As Emily said.
Yeah.
Yes.
I like that. So Emily's saying, yeah, starting to question whether or not your project is good enough or interesting enough, because then it's actually quite hard sometimes to find the gap and to figure out what that hook is. I think definitely some of this sort of soul searching does lead you to start to think, hang on, is this the right kind of project? Is it interesting enough?
And also, like you say, there's a lot you want to say, but you don't want to waffle as well. And getting the balance right, making sure you're not missing anything critical out in the debate, but also staying within the lane of your subject, because there's obviously lots of levels to your project. You know, there is the discipline that you're all studying.
Oh yeah, paced away, Deborah. That's great.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Sorry, Matt. Go on. I interrupted you then.
Sorry, no. I was sort of saying about the idea that, you know, you all have a discipline, and then there will be different focuses within your discipline, and then your project probably comes under one of those focuses, and then it might be kind of focused within that, and it's about working out where do I need to sit. You know, like if I'm doing a psychology project, well, there's, you know, 5, 6 dominant schools of psychology, the way they approach understanding human behavior. I don't need to begin by detailing the background of all 5 or 6 schools of thought. So that kind of eliminates that. But then how much of the particular school of thought that you're doing your project on, for example, do you end up putting in? And that's a real balancing act, I think.
I think as well that what Emily said there kind of reminds me of something that I kind of went through, which was I think the start of my project came out of kind of really not liking a lot of what I'd read and studied on the modules during my master's course. So my master's was in translation, and a lot of it was very sort of practical. You know, how do we translate? How do we be freelancers? How do we use software? And out of that, I got really frustrated because I felt like nothing that we were doing helped explain how we translate novels and literature and poetry. So I think for me at first, the problem was that aspect of it wasn't being heard. And then as I got further into the project, I think that translated into something that felt a little bit more productive. And then what I started to do was fill a theoretical gap, as opposed to just be really angry and kind of contradictory to where I'd started. So I think that gap can change as you work through this process, you know, and as you read more and as you develop your project, what initially felt like a problem or issue, that itself may start to evolve.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that brings up a great wider point as well about your dissertation is this permanently evolving document, really, isn't it? And your relationship with it, your relationship with the piece of research, it's very much, I talk about the literature review as being this living document that is almost constantly in flux until you actually submit the final project, because that relationship and everything does keep changing.
Yeah.
Thank you for everyone who's kind of put something into the group chat, and for anyone who hasn't had a chance to yet, if they want to, please do feel free to post anything, any thoughts, reflections that you have into there. Thank you for the people that are posting their things in. I'm going to have a read of those after the session. That's absolutely fantastic. I'm really looking forward to reading them. As I sort of said last time, I'm just looking forward to hearing about what all of you are studying and researching. So I'm going to revisit those, but I'm going to move on into the next couple of slides now. Did we both click that? Oh,
Sorry.
no. No. It was just me. Sorry. Ignore that. Just technical problems. Right. So thinking about this idea of what makes your project unique and finding the gap and finding the place for your research, can think about this in terms of what I would call finding your frame. Because the thing that makes your research unique is its specific intersection of multiple factors. Because hopefully no other project has looked at things in exactly the way that your project is going to. But you do need to find the frame for your research. And by frame, I mean this is the background for your research. That's what I'm talking about here. When we talk about, situating your work against the wider body of academic literature, that's what I'm talking about when I'm saying finding a frame. And then that can help you focus your writing in terms of your literature review, for example, that point that Emily raised about waffle. If you can find the place where the factors intersect and then this kind of bubble in the middle where your research sits, that can often help kind of draw together that focus and help you reduce that chance of waffling. And one of the ways you do that is by finding the conversations that are happening adjacent to your work. And by conversations, I mean the academic back and forth, the theories that are related to what you're writing about. Maybe they're some of the pieces of research where you're changing something within the methodology to address a problem that there was or something like that. But these conversations are adjacent to what you're doing. And then you can contextualize your research against these conversations, these theories, these pieces of research, whilst also evaluating them. So that's part of your critical engagement. And I'm not going to go into critical engagement today because we've got another session on that coming up in I think a couple of weeks. But it's a really important thing to do throughout your whole dissertation, is thinking about the position of your project and also being critical and evaluative of the wider literature, recognizing that your project makes its own unique contribution. So how do we go about actually kind of finding this frame and finding these conversations? One of the things we need to do to start finding those is to think about everything that goes into your research project. So I'm going to pose a hypothetical piece of research here about someone that wants to look at the relationship between academic success in level 7, so master's students, and their participation in study groups. So if I was going to think about researching this, I'd want to begin by thinking about all of the possible factors that could go into this relationship. And to be honest with you, I've probably cut this a little bit short for kind of the purpose of demonstration here. There are probably more factors that go into this relationship, but these were the ones that really jumped out at me when I thought about this. So we've got, criteria for academic success. What's it like to transition between being an undergraduate and postgraduate? Thinking about the role of study groups at multiple levels of education. And this is one of the things that I do think is worth talking about, is that when I say here study groups at multiple levels of education, I might include in my literature review some discussion of study groups in high schools, for example, not just in university settings. And it is about thinking about what parts of the literature are related to and relevant to my topic, what conversations are going to have some overlap with what I'm doing, even if they're not directly related. And this is an especially important thing to think about if you're writing about a topic that there isn't a lot of research on. You often have to get a bit creative. To pick up your question, undergraduate and postgraduate. Sorry, I was just using the shortening to keep the words kind of concise on the slide. So yeah, UG stands for undergraduate, PG, postgraduate. No problem. We also want to think about the success of study groups. It's all very well and good talking about, study groups have been implemented at these levels, but what has the success rate been? Because, you want to think about, again, your research. If it turns out that study groups aren't just very good in general, well, maybe this piece of research doesn't need to happen. So again, situating yourself in the conversation. And what you're likely to find is probably that the success of groups is mediated by other variables, and that's something that you would take account of in your own piece of research. And then finally, we might think about what are the postgraduate experiences of university? Do they feel that they're meeting the level that they want to in terms of their academic achievement? Would they actually be interested in participating in a study group? So then what we do, once you've got these factors all together, all these parts that make up your project, we kind of put these into a Venn diagram. Except because you've got lots of factors, the Venn diagram starts to kind of look quite complicated, and it ends up looking more like what I'm calling a research daisy. And it's an idea that I've taken from a paper by a fantastic author called Luca, who talks about how we navigate the massive information that's out there and how we can do that in an effective way to find the focus of our project, to draw out what is unique about it. So on the next slide, we've got an example of what this research daisy might look like. So in the center, we have this proposed piece of research. And then around that, we have the factors that I just talked about. And obviously they end up forming this sort of these petal-like shapes, hence research daisy. But you can see where you start to get these overlapping parts of these factors, and these intersections become those conversations that I've been talking about. And then you begin to think about your research in the center as adjacent to all of these conversations, and it helps to start focus your reading, your engagement, and the way that you position your research when you're writing it up. And like I've said, I really do want to drive home this idea of thinking about what is unique about your research, because by really identifying that, by recognizing that your research sits at the intersection of lots of different factors, it will help you convey why it's important, why it needs to be done, and then in turn should help you better recognize its contribution when you come to be writing your discussion or conclusions, recommendations, whatever it's called in your discipline, way down the line. So I'm now going to hand over to Kirsty, who I believe is going to take us through an activity about developing our own research daisies.
I am, but before we do, I just wanted to ask you a question about the research daisy and how you've
Yes.
used it before. How do you know, maybe this is a really random question, like how do you know when to stop? Like when you've done this previously and made your own research daisy, how do you know when to stop adding petals? Like what for you is a good point at which you sort of work with what you've got so far?
I think one of the things to do is accept that this is actually a process that you go through several times. So
Right.
I did one of these, or I did several of these relatively recently for the thesis that I'm working on at the moment. And I think you list to begin with every factor that you think might even be slightly related. And then when you start to actually map it onto the daisy, it's the factors that you realize don't really have any intersections with anything else are most likely the factors that you can take out of it, so you can remove that petal, and then that starts to refine the process inwards a little bit. So you
Okay,
sort of
yeah.
do it several times, you go through several iterations of the process, and then you end up with something like this. And like I said, I think there probably are more than 5 key factors that would go into this hypothetical piece of research. So I was sort of in the privileged position there of just being able to make the daisy kind of in the first go to show what it ends up looking like. But it's, I think, an important process to go through, because you realize the more overlap there is between these factors, probably the more important those conversations are to your project.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
No, it does. Yeah, I'm just thinking as well, it's probably a nice way of narrowing things down, because I think often what happens when you start to delve into a topic at first, there's lots of things you care about, lots of things you're interested in, and sometimes you accidentally think, oh, I've accidentally stumbled across a PhD and I need to write a master's project
Because you need to write, yeah,
that is doable and achievable. So, okay, so that notion of then if there's points and ideas that actually don't intersect with much, that's an indication to you that you could maybe put them aside and focus.
exactly.
Amy asks, could these factors then result in perhaps the factors of a literature review?
Yeah, I think this is a really good way of guiding your literature review. In fact, I've used the Research Daisy to guide the literature review that I've written, because often these end up becoming very close to what the chapter headings in the literature review become. And then you're going to have different points where you talk about the intersections, and then you might have a chapter at the end of the literature review where you're talking about, again, taking all of the little gaps, the little problems from all of these different areas, and then what your research is doing with that. So yes, I think this is a really good way of guiding your reading.
I think, yeah, because one of the things with literature reviews as well that can be challenging is you set off writing different sections, and sometimes you think, oh, but how do I transition between section A and section B? They can sometimes feel like very different, but the DAISY is quite nice because you might think if you start off with criteria for academic success, it makes the most sense then to move to an adjacent petal in the next subheading in that literature review because it's a more natural progression of the argument.
Absolutely. So Emily's question here, do you have a resource where we can read more examples of this or any research articles? Actually, yes. I have included the reference at the end of this session to Luca's book. And the idea of the research, Daisy, is taken from chapter 5, a chapter wonderfully called Salsa Dancing in the Social Sciences. And it's really a chapter about how do we navigate the sheer amount of information that is out there now, because you get so many results, and how do you find what's important, and the DAISY is one of the tools that you have to that. And the rest of Lucas' book is also fantastic if you're writing really any research project, but especially if you're somewhat more socially science focused, it's really good. So the reference for that is going to be in the last slide. I believe the book is available online. Frustratingly, I know the library has physical hard copies, but obviously that's not much good to anyone at the moment. I will have a look and see if we can find the online book.
I have one last question before I do introduce the activity, Matt.
Yeah.
In the same way, when you write about literature, you might reference like a CASP tool, or you might say, I've used this particular approach to the literature. Is Luca something that you could reference in your literature review to almost say, the literature has been ordered using Luca's research, Daisy? Could you bring it in as a reference, I guess?
Absolutely, because it's it's in a published academic textbook, and it's a reasonable.
And it wouldn't be weird to mention that,
No, I think it's a slightly newer way of approaching the literature. I think the book was written in 2008.
Okay.
Luca is not necessarily the traditional academic. He's slightly younger, slightly newer in his approach, but absolutely, I think, as I said, it was recommended to me by my supervisor, so there's definitely a precedent for that now. And I think it approaches it in just a slightly different way, and for me it really clicked. For some of you it might not, but I think it's worth having at least a go at it and seeing if it's a useful tool to you, and if it's not, you don't have to use it. I think that's the great thing if you prefer something like the CASP tool or something like that.
Yeah. Okay, so in that spirit then, that's what the activity that I'm going to introduce now. So we're going to have a quick go at this and see if it helps us again to start thinking about our research projects and get to know them a little better. So what we'd like you to do is, again, we're going to keep our mics muted and sort of work silently at this stage on the same activity. What we'd like you to do is, first of all, grab a pen and a piece of paper or open yourself a new Word doc and begin by doing a bit of a mind dump. So just empty your brain right now of all of those different factors that go into your research. And I think at this stage, don't see yourself. So don't be thinking, what are the big ideas? What are the smaller ideas? Just get, as Matt was saying, any kind of factor or any aspect that you think fits into your project, get that down on paper or type that into a document. Step 2 then that we'd like you to do is to start to create one of those Venn diagrams. So to perhaps begin to draft out a research DAISY where you start to place those factors next to each other and mapping out where they overlap and where they begin to intersect. So what we're going to do is just focus on steps 1 and 2 for now and begin to construct that list and then move it into that Venn diagram or that research DAISY. And then once we've done that, we're going to move into some breakout rooms to discuss. So I think if we spend, what do you think, Matt? What's a good amount of time to do the list and the Venn diagram? About 10 minutes?
Yes, I think that sounds good.
Okay, so it's just after 5:02. So if we have 10 minutes then, first of all, if everyone wants to make that list for themselves, and then I'll tell you after about 5 minutes when you might want to start moving that into a Venn diagram. Okay, so hopefully everybody's got some ideas down on the page there. Don't worry too much if you've not been able to form a complete research DAISY stage. That's okay. And this is something, as Matt says, that you can revisit, come back to later, and that you may actually go through several versions of your to sort of shape your project and decide what to focus on. What we are going to do now, though, is just do a bit of a breakout room activity to give you a chance to chat to some other people and share your ideas on this activity. So There's 2 questions we'd like you to consider, and I'll make sure I share these with the room so you'll have these to refer back to. But question 1, we'd like you to consider which petals or overlaps on your daisy right now feel like they need a little bit extra work. Is there anything right now that you're unsure of, or that you feel that you would definitely need to work on in order to make that transition or that link between those 2 factors, or link between those 2 petals? Secondly, have a think about what overlapping conversations might be useful to help guide your research. So in other words, when you look at that research daisy and you look at those different factors, which ones feel most prominent to you? Which of those relationships feel right now like they're going to be really important parts of your research project? Okay. What we're going to do now then is start the breakout rooms, and we'll spend 10 minutes there having a chat about these questions. Now, feel free to use the microphones. Alternatively, you can, of course, use window, whatever you'd prefer to do. You'll be in a group with 2 other participants, and you'll have about 10 minutes to chat through these questions and, of course, share any other thoughts or conversations on those research daisies. So I'll start those now, and then we'll be back in the main room in about 10 minutes. Okay, so that should be everyone back in the main room. Again, sorry if that came a bit suddenly if you were in the middle of a conversation. We tried to give you a little bit of warning, but as in the induction section, it's always a bit of a shock to rejoin the main room. So before we carry on, could you guys maybe just use the chat? Let us know. Is there anything interesting that came out of your conversations? Has it given you any ideas to take forwards after this session? So if you could just pop in any comments or feedback into the chat about how those conversations went, that would be really helpful before we just move on and tie the session up. Oh, so Debola asking, is there any number of petals that's too small or too many? Have you got any kind of advice on that, Matt?
I think my initial answer is no, because every project is kind of as big or as small as it needs to be. I think I'd say if maybe you had less than 4 petals, I'd be thinking that you might not be thinking about the full scope of your project.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, if I was being forced to maybe more than 8 petals, I think you might be starting to think beyond the scope of what a master's project might be. But also, because the daisy that you develop is very personal to you, some people might use very broad categories for that to name their petals, and then they might only have, you know, 4 or 5, and some people might be more specific. So it depends kind of how you're thinking about those in your head as well.
I know some people have not used research daisies in this way, but certainly it's sort of mind maps. What you can sometimes do is almost draw a number of petals and challenge yourself to fill them in. So if you did start out maybe with a daisy with 4 empty petals or 4 empty circles, you might then want to think, right, if I had to give 4 petals, kind of does that help? As almost like a brainstorming activity, you know, to help you think of new factors and things to include. I think in response to your comment there, Emily, finding that this isn't quite clicking for you, maybe because it's a qualitative project. I think if this doesn't work for you, that's absolutely fine.
Yeah.
I think this is one way of trying to think about where are those overlaps and conversations. Later on down the line, when you get to the findings, some of these overlaps and thematic links, that's the point at which they maybe start to become a bit clearer. So I certainly wouldn't worry or be disheartened if this doesn't quite click, because there's certainly other models that we'll be sharing and that we can pop on the website for everyone to take a look at. So if the petal model and the research daisy isn't the one for you, I don't think that's cause for concern. Would you say, Matt?
100%. I think, like I said, it's about finding the thing that works for you, and if this doesn't, that's absolutely fine, and that's not a fault of you. That's just because it doesn't personally gel for you. And I also think, like I said, you might realize later on some of the things are useful, and actually, if you've got a good sense of where you want your literature review to be right now, you don't necessarily need to call upon that. So yeah, and like Kirsty said, we're going to have lots of different approaches. You know, this is just one thing that I came across relatively recently for me and really clicked for me. But yeah.
Cool. So what I just wanted to do before we kind of tie everything together is just do a bit of a walkthrough, because I was new to research daisies. So in kind of planning this session, I was having to think about, can I make sense of it for myself, and can I sort of try and visualize that to share with everyone this session. So I was thinking about how can we adapt that daisy model for some focused reading. So in other words, if there's a particular petal on that daisy or a particular factor or feature of your project that you want to delve into in more detail, how could you use that model again in a different way? So let's imagine here that at the centre of our daisy is now a specific aspect of that project. So maybe a theme from our reading, in this case, postgraduate experiences of university, but it could be any theme that we place at the centre of this second daisy. What we can then do when we place the petals is think about their position as a way of emphasising their relationship to each other. So in this sense here, we've got theory A on the left-hand side and theory B on the right-hand side. And what we've done there is place them as far apart as possible to help in our minds show that these are contrasting or opposing theories on that particular topic. So when you're writing your own research daisy, it could be that you can start to place these opposing ideas or these contrasting concepts on opposite sides of that daisy. As you read more, though, when you kind of focus in your reading, it may be that you start to pick out where are there theories or concepts that actually share similar features, or maybe they share a particular context or an attribute in some way. Again, on the research daisy, we can start to move those petals around to reflect the nature of that relationship. So in this example here, we've got theory A and theory B, and we recognise that although separate, they do start to overlap a little bit, and there are perhaps some papers out there that bring those two theories together. Or even it could be that you can think of a scenario, you've started to think of an example where actually those two theories start to come into contact with each other. You could maybe cherry pick aspects of each and use them in that interesting way or that unique way that you've come up with yourself. So this intersection of these ideas could happen in the literature, or it could be a suggestion that you yourself come up with. Similarly, on this daisy, we've got theory A and B perhaps moving closer together. And then on the other side of the daisy, contrasting them, is theory C. And that's helping us to clarify the links and the relationship between some of those theoretical models. Have a think about as well, if you do have these big ideas or these theories or concepts that at first seem like they're not, through your reading and as you develop your project, you start to identify where are ideas or studies that mediate that relationship between those big ideas. So in other words, can you use your reasoning or can you find additional literature that act as a kind of stepping stone that help move the reader from big idea A through several ideas, they then start to move over to your second big idea. So what you're doing here is using the literature to really clearly explain your line of thinking and your reasoning to the reader. So let's say that you've identified two areas in the literature related to your key topic, but at first they seem kind of incompatible. So we started reading and researching about postgraduate experiences of university. And one thing we've come across, one idea we've come across is that postgraduate students have this, they're assumed to be experts. So your lecturers or course tutors assume that you've got that expert knowledge on the subject. But we've also come across another concept in the literature that says that postgraduates at university experience a big shift towards research-based learning. So we're thinking, hang on a minute, we've got these two aspects of a postgraduate experience. How can you be an expert but be doing completely new research-based learning? How do those two factors add up? Well, through the research daisy, what we could do is place them, first of all, on opposite sides of that central theme. And then we might start to draw on the literature and on our own thinking to bridge the divide between those ideas. So how do we get from these seemingly contrasting points of view? Well, first of all, we might think that this expert status that master's students often have is probably kind of contributed to by the fact that they have this range of experiences. I bet everybody in this group chat right now has very different backgrounds. Some of you will have backgrounds in education. Some of you will have been working for a long time. There's that whole range of experience and background there that's contributing to this expert status. Linked to that is that actually by bringing together that wealth of experiences and backgrounds, it actually means that as a group of students, you're really well placed to generate new ideas and perspectives. You've got that range of experience. You're on a course sat next to somebody that's got a whole different range of experiences. That then might account for or help to explain why there is such a shift towards research-based learning. Actually, as a group of students, if you're well placed to generate new ideas, then the best place to do that is through the research. So this is just a quick example that I put together yesterday, but it was helpful for me to think about starting from these ideas that seem, first of all, to have no connection whatsoever. Can you use something like the Research Daisy to encourage you to kind of search for those links and really figure out what's the basis of those logical arguments? Then you can present this in the literature review or put it forward in the write-up, and it helps connect the dots. It really helps move you through from part A to part B and explains that line of reasoning. So this is just something I wanted to share with you as a bit of a visual example of how you might adapt that Research Daisy for some really focused reading on your topics. I'll hand over to Matt then, I think, to finish off.
Yes. So, first of all, it's quite a lot that I think we've gone through today, quite a lot to take in, and don't worry if some of it seems a bit abstract at the moment. I would really implore you to make use of the discussion board, and if you have questions following this session, please do post them onto the discussion board and we'll get back to you. You know, anything that you want to ask about today's session. So, next steps. Got some recommended reading for you guys. As with all of the tasks we give you, this is not essential, but it is the chapter from Luca's book, Salsa Dancing into the Social Sciences, chapter 5, that goes into more detail about the Research Daisy. We've had a look. Unfortunately, Hallam doesn't have the online ebook at the moment, but we're going to look into if we can get that purchased for you, and as soon as we've got that purchased and online and set up, we'll let you guys know. Also, I'm going to look into if I can host a shared library with you guys through RefWorks, and then I should be able to share the document with you. So until we've done that, don't worry too much about that one, but we'll keep you informed on that. In terms of the online task, we'd like you to refine your Research Daisy and post it to the discussion board. Have a go at kind of taking a photo of it, or if some people make them in PowerPoint or whatever, and post it onto the discussion board, and we can have a chat about it. And if you're thinking, is this enough petals? Have I been too narrow? Have I been too broad? We can have a conversation about that and a discussion going about how you might focus it or kind of broaden it. Then next session is actually this Thursday at 11. The HIT session though, so it's going to be basically primarily writing. There's not really any content. We're just going to do a bit of goal setting at the beginning, then we're going to do some extended chunks of writing. So really good if you just want to come along, get some words down in your dissertation. I'm going to be working on my thesis. I don't know, for those of you who saw on the discussion board, as I said, totally failing at writing up my thesis at the moment. So I'm going to be in the trench in that HIT session as well. And then I think our next kind of content session, it's on the LibGuide. I think it's in 2 weeks' time, and it's about developing your critical response. But like I say, it'd be great to see some of you, all of you, in the HIT session on Thursday, and that, like I say, that's at 11. As usual, Kirsty and I are going to hang around for a few minutes at the end here if anyone wants to stick around, ask some questions. Otherwise, you're free to leave. Thanks everyone for coming along, being an active participant. It's been fantastic. Hopefully you've got something out of the session as well.